Well, welcome everyone to the final session of the day, which is the art of science. My name is Christine Lowy, and as Hazel mentioned, I am the executive director of the Port Angeles Fine Arts Center, which is a nonprofit based in Port Angeles, devoted to inspiring the artist in every person. My organization is located all of a quarter of a mile away from Olympic National Park Visitor Center. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context of how I've ended up in this room today to facilitate this lovely final exhibit with these three artists. So we maintain a gallery and a 5-acre sculpture park that's open to the public 7 days a week. And we offer a variety of programs through my organization that includes artist workshops, community talks, gallery exhibits, and a host of arts integrated for youth, as we aim to connect people to the arts. Much like our national park neighbor, we draw on the beauty of our natural surroundings to help our community deepen their sense of place and find inspiration. So a study goal at our art center has been to offer programming that sparks unique conversations between art, nature, and science. And so we often align ourselves with community partners that can help further that goal. And in particular, we frequently work with Olympic National Park staff on a variety of different endeavors. In particular, we've collaborated on a number of shared public education opportunities through our exhibits and offering community talks. And in the last several years, we've offered 3 partnership exhibits, and those have included in 2021, Conservation from Here. In 2023, we helped Olympic National Park staff host an in-person showing of selected artworks from their online exhibit called Terminus, which is to memorialize our receding glaciers. And all the artists who are on this talk today have helped out with that, or were key pieces to that particular online exhibit. And most recently in 2024, we had the opportunity to highlight Olympic National Park and those artists connected with the park during our summer exhibit, which was celebrating artists whose work was inspired by the Elwha Dam removal. The timing of this particular session was perfect in terms of the latest exhibit that we have actually in our organization in talking about this crossover between art and science, because we just launched our latest exhibit on Friday, which is entitled Water Connects Us All, and that's a partnership with the Port Angeles Marine Discovery Center. And this particular exhibit celebrates the work of 7 artists who are using their scientific background and expertise to generate artworks that convey a variety of important conservation messages related to the ocean. So much like the discussion that we're going to have today, that exhibit calls attention to how artists can help to increase our understanding of scientific research. And just a little plug for the Art Center. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to pfac.org. But for today, I'd like to introduce the 3 artists who are also doing this really incredibly important work of translating scientific information into visually compelling imagery that really helps us shape our relationship to our natural world and in particular to our public lands. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of how things will go, each artist will present about their art practice, then we'll have a short panel discussion, and then finally we'll open up for questions. So please feel free to add your questions into the chat as we go, and then we'll come back to that during that final section of question and answer rather than individually during each of those. So with that, I'd love to introduce our very first artist, which is Claire Giordano. Did I get that right, Claire? Yay. She's an environmental artist, a writer, and educator who's creatively exploring the interwoven patterns of people, place, and climate change. In her interdisciplinary work, Claire strives to create visual and virtual spaces that foster connection between individuals and our warming world. Claire is also the founder of Adventure Art Academy, where she teaches virtual classes where she films her out during her hiking adventures. So whether she's painting in the wilderness or teaching online, Claire invites others into the painting process and shares the joy of exploring our world with watercolor. Claire, I'd love for you to take over with your screen and mic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine, for that beautiful intro. And just give me a minute here, folks. I'm going to share my screen and go ahead and get my presentation going. So let me just get that rolling. And does that look okay, Christine? Hopefully we're seeing a photo of me out on an ice field. Wonderful. Also gonna start my little timer so I keep myself on schedule. Well, again, thank you to Christine and all the wonderful folks here in Hazel, especially for be part of this project today and for the opportunity to get to share a little bit about my work and what I do at the intersection of climate change and science communication and trying to connect people with place in the work that I get to do as an artist. And in many ways, when I try to think of, what was the theme that I wanted to underlie the various, two projects I want to share with you today, it was really this phrase that came from the project I did for Olympic National Park, and that is art is an expression of hope. It's words that I have really come to through my collaborations with scientists in the field, and it's something that now I think is foundational to how I approach each and every project, and that I hope to not only invite people into what that experience is in a creative way, but also to try to help them feel maybe a little hope when they leave and not just grief or loss at what's changing in our landscapes. We already got a lovely little intro and bio for Christine. And throughout my presentation, you'll give a very brief image description of the photos as well, just in case for accessibility. And this is a photo of me here wearing a hat in the wintertime. So underlying all of the work that I do as an artist is a very robust field practice. So in the same way that scientists will go out to the field to collect data, I spend 80 to 100 days out of the year. That's been the average for the past 4 years, out on hiking trips, art residencies, my own trips to go explore and hopefully be documenting and visiting places that are impacted by climate change. And given the widespread broad impact, that is a lot of a lot of places, right? And I feel so grateful that my work as an artist has brought me to so many wonderful and incredible places. This photo here was from an art residency last summer with the Voices of the Wilderness program, where I actually got to spend 7 days out kayaking with the wilderness rangers out there in Tracy Arm. And my main goal for that experience was to create paintings like this, where I'm documenting firsthand the receding glaciers in an area, especially in Tracy Arm, where the Sawyer and South Sawyer Glacier are not receiving the same level of documentation and scientific, rigorous, record keeping of their recession because they're so hard to access. You're either going boat or plane, or you're being flown in, or you're kayaking in to get in to see these places. So that was one example of that field work. And over the last, oh gosh, I think 5 years, I have had the opportunity to do 18 art residencies. These vary in the partners, everything from land agencies, like in that last image up in Tracy Arm, all the way I've worked with different national parks, Olympic National Park, Crater Lake, Capitol Reef, and even some BLM organizations as well, but also working alongside scientists. And when I did all that field work, one of the projects that arose from all of that time outside sketching and just really wishing that there was a way that I could share these stories of changing landscapes and what we were doing out there with a broader audience led me to actually start the program that Christine mentioned, the Adventure Art Academy, which is my online series of art classes. And I'll be honest, at first I wasn't expecting this program and this series to not only go on for 4 years now, I just hit the 4 year anniversary, but also for it to be platform for sharing what's happening with our landscapes with a super broad audience of people, especially people who, for many of my students, would not get to access these places in person. And this image here that shows a painting of some wildflowers and then another painting of looking out toward Chihuahua Mountain and Lyman Lakes, which is a formerly and relatively recently deglaciated terrain. This is a place that's pretty hard to get to. You have to be in very good physical condition. You have to have the time it takes to go get out there, a vehicle that can get out there. And I didn't realize when I first started all of this that for many of my students, again, for so many different reasons why these places are inaccessible, whether through physical disability or financial limitations or geographic, whatever it is, I am their primary, not only their primary access to nature, but I am also their primary access to a firsthand account of climate change and how places that I get to go are changing over time. And I get to go to places in Washington. I've been up to Alaska. I did this. This is a painting here of part of Capitol Reef National Park. You can see there. This is another example of a painting from Crater Lake. And what I think for me is so interesting about doing this class series, I think I have nearly 50 classes now, which is pretty incredible. And there's been more than 1,000 students who come through the program. And then right now, I currently have 350 students who are actively subscribed to and interacting with and doing these classes each month, which is kind of mind-boggling and incredible to me. Is that each of these little adventures I create for people, I'm not hitting them over the head, right, with scientific concepts. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, right? If I'm out with Dr. Maury Pelto of the North Cascade Glacier Climate Project, and like they're in the frame and I'm narrating what's happening and maybe they get interviewed or something, that's a pretty obvious one. Others, like this one at Crater Lake, was an experience where I got this crazy, unseasonable late season snowstorm in May, where it dumped snow in a 48 or 48-ish hour period of time at this location. And that was really unusual. At the same time, right before that snow fell, the park was at 33% of its normal snow level. So just by painting this place with people at this time of year and sharing that video footage, they got to experience, right, what was happening in this place. And then within 2 weeks later, I was down at Petrified Forest National Park and filmed classes down there for my students, where it was a red flag warning, 55-mile-an-hour wind, 105-degree temperatures, and the one of the heat records for that area in Arizona for that early in the year. So I feel really lucky every time I get to go out and invite my students into these projects with me, and really just to try to make it feel like they are sitting there next to me, watching these places develop and change. And I go back to some now. If I had enough time, I get to go back for a second time or show them from a different perspective. And it's always just my hope that I try to open the door as best I can for people to have curiosity about a landscape and then possibly a personal connection to that as well. And I really do believe that art is the most powerful avenue I personally have to try to invite people into that conversation and into that curiosity and into that connection, because what more intimate way in some ways than to paint a landscape to get to know it. And then the other project I wanted to briefly highlight was the one that Christine mentioned, which was the glacier project that we did with Olympic National Park, the Terminus Glacier Memorial Project. And for mine, I very intentionally, when I was selected, I was so excited. And I intentionally chose one of the glaciers that had completely disappeared by the time this project happened. So these are three paintings you hear in this, or you see in this frame of the Lillian Glacier, which disappeared in 2015. So the one on the left side of your screen shows the glacier as it appeared in 1905, I believe. The central painting shows that empty bowl in that landscape in 2015, when it was officially marked as a deceased glacier in the records for the park. And then the one on the right is actually an imagining of that same landscape 100 years in the future. So what might be changing? What avenue of hope can we find to see how this place, yes, we lost the glacier, but it will also become a refuge for animals and plants as they're forced higher and higher in elevation in this place. To complete this project, I spent 18 days backpacking out in the Olympic National Park. Here's a photo of one of the student groups I was out with for the University of Washington. So special thanks to Tim Billow for inviting me out with his students for 2 years running, and also to Bill Bacchus as well from the Olympic National Park for all of his wonderful information. And I spent a lot of time hanging out in the park, getting to really hike through in a really personal way these entire ecosystems from down deep in these rainforest valleys all the way up to and next to some of the glaciers, and then some of the, most importantly for my paintings, this post-glacial terrain. So I like this photo you see here where we have, this was glaciated probably not that long ago, relatively, and being able to look at that landscape and see, okay, if this was glaciated 100 years ago and now it looks like this, and then this next zone, and follow that progression upward, you can literally hike through and get to experience what's going to happen to these places over time. And also during that period when I was outside with those students, that was when the words that fill that middle painting, which if I go back a couple of frames, you can see that there is text in the space of where the glacier used to be. And that was when these words were written down in my field journal, some of them scribbled on the back of my paintings from when I was out there, and especially when I got to actually look up at and be below the basin of where this glacier used to be. And I wanted to end by reading those words to you. I feel like in many ways they summarize the sentiment that I try to bring to my paintings and my teaching and my collaborations with scientists. So I wanted to share those words with you. Yeah, I need to move my little Zoom screen over. So these are, again, from my field journals out there. So I wrote, art is an expression of hope. It is not the blind faith of optimism, nor the empty sadness of pessimism. It is an action. an act of finding beauty in loss and in grief, an act of memory, calling the past into the present and imagining a future when this glacier might someday re-emerge from winter snowfields. A future where the wasteland of rock is filled with pillows of moss and fields of wildflowers. A future where trees find solid footing in the bedrock of a dead glacier. In every line on the page, I lay down the paths of a eulogy that winds its way through my heart to my hands to my pigments. My voice. This is my voice. This is my love for this place. This is my joy at exploring and witnessing and seeing. And my hands are harbingers of change, changing climate, changing perspectives, changing hearts, changing connections as we find our way back to our home. Home, this beautiful and resilient and shared home. I paint because I have hope. I paint as hope. I paint to share this hope with others. Thank you all so much. And if anyone here would like to connect with me, there's my email as well. And I would love to hear from you. So I'll hand it over to Christine and Suze, it seems like next.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. Um, Maddie, would you mind if I jump to Sue's next or are you ready to roll?
You can go for it.
Okay, great. I'll introduce Sue's next and then Maddie last. So next up we have Sue's, and Sue's work is about human relationship to nature. A painter, she explores media from watercolor to paper casting, artist books to pyrography and installation, and sometimes all together. She's exhibited in Washington State, in Utah, Maryland, Colorado, California, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Washington, D.C. And she's held residencies in Zion, Glacier, Capitol Reef, and the North Cascades National Park. So we've gotten around a bit, Suze. I look forward to hearing your presentation. Suze, you're muted.
All right, great. You can hear me? Can you hear me?
Sound great.
Okay, good. So I can add Great Basin National Park to that list this last year. I'm happy to be here. You could see my slides.
Looks good, Suze. I can see you.
Okay, for some reason they're not moving forward. Okay, so let me go back. All right, about 17 years ago, I a newly burned area and was absolutely riveted. I started painting the entire burned landscapes. I tried burning some of those paintings. That one I used a soldering iron from where I was doing a residency, and this one was my daughter's chef's torch, but I felt they looked too much like paint. I tried installing some paintings out in the woods in the winter. Couldn't have done it without friends' help. I learned some mold making from a former Pratt instructor here in Seattle. And I realized that it was the char on trees, the kind of structured randomness that really made my visual neurons buzz. And I was literally hiking, I think it was in Zion, one foot in front of the other, when I suddenly thought, these are on paper. They don't have to be rectangles. It could be any shape I want. So I started making this burn tree series from all different places all over the West by tearing the paper first before I painted on it. So this is just a very quick look at some of the now 61 pieces of burned trees that I've painted. And more. And I've had a lot of help from various foresters. During the pandemic lockdown, I painted one that was 21.5 feet wide. I always said most of those previous images I showed were the width of a roll of watercolor paper. And this is closer to the length of a roll of watercolor paper. And the most recent thing I did, I departed from doing trunks and did a stump from the Bolt Creek fire on Stevens Pass in Washington. It had obviously been logged probably over 100 years ago, and then the stump burned last year, 2 years ago. So I keep trying to find different ways to use these works as a way to connect. I got 30 of them printed on fabric in layers of 3, a transparent, a solid, and then either a black or a text. And I worked with a wildland firefighter in Colorado who wrote stories for a number of them. This is from a World Forestry Center installation in Portland last year. So I keep trying to figure out ways to expand the meaning and the connection and the conversation with these works. So that very large 21.5-foot one has been also done in fabric layers with more stories by Lorena Williams. They've been made into a book. And most recently, I added a fire pit on the floor to some installations. And that fire pit has objects spray painted black that represent the 3 largest carbon emitting sectors of the US economy. So another whole body of work that is related to climate is bark beetle damage in particular towns, but in many places. It seemed like everywhere I went on my various residencies, I was seeing evidence of bark beetles. And they're aggravated by climate. They're not kept in check by colder winters anymore. It's only a few species that mass attack live trees, but those few wreak a lot of havoc. They can girdle a conifer in 5 to 7 days. And everyone says they're called galleries, look like some kind of strange writing, like a script. So it seemed like the thing I should do was make books of them. So this one's called Encyclopedia Beetletania, and couldn't have done it without this particular binding method, or it's a cooperative site called barkbeetles.org that documents many things about over 6,000 species. And I have had so much help and consultation and expertise with these, whether it's materials or how to perform a certain kind of medium, data. The BC government publishes data for different tree mortality in different timber supply areas. This one, if I go back a second, you can see each page is a bar from a bar chart, and the book as a whole is a graph of beetle kill mortality. This one has data about Northwest forests in it. The fold came from a mechanical engineer and a mathematician make something to send a cylinder up to the space station, and they published their origami fold. The data is from our regional forest service. If you were to unfold the origami, that is what it looks like. And it's a 97 to 2008 beetle kill mortality in a section of north central Washington. I've worked with letterpress printers, a scientist who studied some of the genetics of trees that did and didn't survive beetle attacks. This is based on a quote from another entomologist who said that both beetles and humans like to make their homes from wood, so we're competing for the same resource. So I took a beetle gallery branch and morphed it into a piece of dimensional lumber. I've worked with at least 4 different poets. This one, I made silicon molds, thanks to Susan Balsher, of different beetle galleries and cast them in paper with help from Mary Ashton. And Dr. Diana Six at the University of Montana helped me identify different diseased areas and species involved. And that one was called, the last one was What the Beatles Wrote. This was what the Beatles sang. I worked with a composer who wrote a suite, one for each section of this log held together by violin clamps. And unfortunately, I don't have time to play it, but if you looked up Aldo Daniel Rivera Renteria and What the Beatles Sang on YouTube, you would find it, and you can hear the suite he wrote, which is wonderful. These are boards that were given to me by a guy who logs, a cabinet maker who logs and mills his own boards, and he can't use the beetle-covered shoulders of the logs. A friend helped me engineer how to hold, this is 36 inches high, so how to hold it up, and it has a kind of children's rhyming alphabet of beetle galleries. And in Dr. Tobin's lab at the University of Washington, he had samples that I took rubbings from and helped me identify the beetles. This one involved another letterpress printer and a collaboration with a poet. And out of the same effort grew yet another piece. Most recently, I've been working together with a paper maker, Debbie Greenwood in Tacoma, to embed wasp paper and contrast it with beetle galleries. So soon, almost finished. And Troy Gua did the epoxy casting. Deborah made the paper. I've had help from Barrett Klein at the University of Wisconsin. He's a professor of both art and entomology. And one of his graduate students, I believe, helped review our texts and even sent us more material for it. My piece in the Terminus project was this craftivist version of scientific cores. I thought, you know, the tree cores, the ice cores, the sediment cores, they only show the past. An artist can add the future. So our ice cores get smaller, the sediment cores get human detritus on the top, and the tree cores get, some of them are burned, some of them have bark beetle larvae, some of them not in the parks, but turn into dimensional lumber. This has been shown a number of places since it was at Port Angeles Fine Arts Center, and it's at the World Forestry Center again in the lower photos. So couldn't have done that without the weaver Janet Stone, the dyer and quilter Arissa Brown, and I did knit and felted the trees. So I look at collaborating with all kinds of people and scientists among them as a mother lode of creativity. I get completely different ideas. And in fact, gave a talk for the Macmillan Foundation earlier this fall on why I think collaboration is such a great thing and what you can do to be a better collaborator. So the list goes on and on and on, and that's just some of the most recent. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Suze. And last but not least, we have Maddi Bacon who will present. Maddi, I'll just introduce you. Maddi is a conservationist, storyteller, and artist. They have spent the past several years working seasonally for conservation corps, national parks, and national forests, which has been a source of much inspiration for their work. Their art takes the form of many mediums, including painting, animation, and comics. I hand it over to you, Maddi.
Awesome. Let's share my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yep, we can see it.
I'll take that. Okay. So yep, my name is Maddi Bacon. I use they, them pronouns. Just a couple photos of me out and about doing things. And a little intro about myself before I talk about some of my art projects is that I went to school for fine art and it turned out my mom was right. when I graduated, I applied to a bunch of art jobs and I didn't get any. And so I applied to an AmeriCorps position and I went out and joined a conservation corps, and it totally changed the trajectory of my life. And so there's a couple photos of me digging, I'm planting some trees, I'm carrying barbed wire. I got to just do a whole bunch of different projects, and I just learned that I really loved doing field work and conservation work, and it sort of projected me into this like new career of like public lands and stewardship. And so I've also spent quite a few seasons working for the Park Service. I've been a trail worker, a wildland firefighter, and I've also been a biotech within the North Coast and Cascades Inventory and Monitoring Network at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. And so, like, this is a couple of photos of us doing eDNA at the park, wetland monitoring, invasive species removal. And like doing this work really brought a ton of just like meaning and purpose to my life. Like, not only did I love being outside, but I just like felt like I was really doing meaningful stuff, and I met lots of really awesome people, like people that were both mentors to me and then people I got to like teach and show things to as well. And in a roundabout way, it sort of allowed me to return to art because I started writing and illustrating comics about the different jobs that I had done and the things that I had learned. And it really was just this, like, I have always really loved comics and I've always kind of wrote and illustrated, but it sort of took on this like new form of like reflection for me where I was kind of using these comics to really like ask questions and think about the things I was learning, and not just like scientific fact, but like how it made me feel about my gender, or how like some science like was related to public health, or how things would affect my mental state based on things that are also going on in like the world at large. And so I have been able to be a part of a couple of really cool projects and artist residencies. And so the first one that I'm going to talk about is I was also one of the artists in the Terminus project at Olympic, where each artist made a piece of art about the specific glacier that they were given. And this is my glacier, Mount Steele. And going into this project, what I really wanted to write about was the glacier monitoring protocol, because I've been a scientist for national parks. And so I was like really fascinated in like, you know, what their data collection was like and sort of like what it felt like to be one of these scientists. And what I found out really quickly is that my glacier, Mount Steele, actually does not get visited for the glacier monitoring protocol. And so I had to start to ask myself, like, how am I going to write this story about this, what I want, but also make it about this glacier that is not visited? And so to start off, I had a 2.5 hour long conversation with Bill Bacchus, the physical scientist at Olympic, and we had a great time. It was a super fun conversation. We really hit it off, and Bill really told me a lot. At one point, we had to switch from like the phone over to Zoom so he could take me on Google Earth and basically like give me a little tour of the things he was talking about. And it really sparked a lot of inspiration and questions in me. And that phone conversation was so important that I actually included it in the comic. And so like, here's a couple of pages from the finished comic that's like me talking to Bill, which then kind of becomes the foundation of this story. But then after that phone call, I spent a lot of time reading scientific articles that had been published about the glaciers. Here's a couple of them with my like highlighting all over the place. I also like spent a lot of time sort of collecting reference photos. So like a lot of these photos were sent to me from Bill, but also some of these are like some screenshots from some other videos that already existed about the glacier monitoring protocol. And from that conversation, reading all of those articles and the photographs, this story started to come out that sort of follows the history of glacier monitoring as it exists in Olympic National Park, and sort of ask the question of like, why do we do long-term studies, and like what is the value of these long-term data sets? These are a couple of the pages in various stages of being done. I work in ink, watercolor, and marker primarily. And so this is kind of them in their various stages. I think it's kind of fun to see them sometimes half done. And so sort of like following that question and narrative of the monitoring, it sort of brings us back to this question of like, what does it mean for us as humans to decide what is or isn't worth studying, because we don't have the time or resources to study every little thing. And so we're inherently creating a bit of a hierarchy of importance when we pick what is worth studying, and why. And I think that question of like, like why are we studying glaciers if they're just going to disappear? Obviously, as a scientist and a nature lover myself, I knew why. I was like, I know like why I think it's like, worth studying these things. But I was also really curious what, Bill and like other technicians thought that are the ones actually going out there and doing this like really difficult, like time consuming, arduous work. And he had this really thoughtful response about how, collecting this data really gives us a narrative and something to say. And it's in this particular instance, it's a narrative about climate change and how these glaciers are changing and how that's going to affect us going forward. And that's something really worthwhile talking about. And so you can see in these last couple pages of the comic, I kind of reflect on that part of our conversation, because I think that was like a really great point that he made. I mean, even if you think about it, doing this data is what creates the narrative for me to then write the comic. So it's kind of meta in that way. And then I was really lucky. The following summer, I was able to accompany the Mountain Lake crew when they went out to Lake Lacrosse, because from Lake Lacrosse, you can see Mount Steele. So I got to hike 42 miles and see my glacier. It was super awesome. The second project I would like to talk about is another residency that I did at Playa. The residency was called Wildfire and Water, Artists and Scientists Collaborating for Change. It was in Paisley, Oregon. And if you don't know where that is, I included a little dot on the map here. So you can see I think it has a population of 300 people. So a lot of people, when I told them I was doing this residency, did not know where Paisley was. So there's some context for you. During this residency, I got to spend 10 days out there at Playa, and we had a combination of field trips and guest speakers who came to sort of like share with us how wildfire and water affected that ecosystem and community specifically. And they've experienced quite a few wildfires in the past couple years of like various intensity levels and various like evacuation levels. So here's a couple of photographs of the cohort out learning from some of our guest speakers. And one thing that I was really struck during this, during the residency, is that when we went out to the fire scar, a lot of the people in my cohort were really sad. They were really sad looking at this burn scar. And I realized that I was not sad. And I really wanted to delve into like why I was having this very different like emotional reaction from everyone else. And so I started writing this comic, really digging into the fire ecology of Eastern Oregon, which is like really super complicated. Here's like a couple of pages where I'm talking about ponderosa pine and the way that fire and the bark beetles sort of interact with the ponderosa pines. But they also have the sagebrush steep out there, which also kind of interacts with fire in a different way and has a different fire history than the ponderosa pine, even though they're all sort of mixed out there in Eastern Oregon. But then like on top of that, we also have this introduction of non-native grasses, which is causing, a shift in the fire activity and regime as well. And I'm like digging into all of these things, and it kind of gets more complicated and like harder to like really just like be straightforward like opinions about like this fire ecology and management. I started sort of like reflecting on some of like the similarities to myself and the way it made me feel. And the comic also started to become kind of like personal and about like my own complicated views of myself and my gender and how I kind of like navigate through the world. And I think it within the story um, reflects this narrative of how complicated both scenarios are. Like, my identity is complicated, and also like fire ecology and the way we manage our lands is like complicated, and there's not necessarily like very good, straightforward answers. And so the comic sort of became this like combination of memoir and feelings, and also ecology and fire and nature, which is not what I thought it was going to be at all when I set out to do it. Um, and so I would encourage anyone who does science to write about the things you're doing and how it makes you feel and what it makes you think of, because, I think a lot of people, um, a lot of people like see my art as science communication, which I don't think is wrong. Like it definitely sort of ends up being that way, but it's not really how I usually set out. I usually set out wanting to use art and comic writing as a way for me to reflect and digest the things that I've learned. And it often reveals a lot of new things to me through the process of art making. So I want more people to do it.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Maddie. We're going to switch on over to a couple of panel questions, and then we're going to open the floor up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, go ahead and get those questions in now while we introduce a few questions amongst ourselves. So I think I'm just going to focus on just two questions out of the conversation after hearing everyone share their stories. I think the first one, Maddie, you touched on this. Love for other folks to talk about this too. But the challenge of translating complex scientific concepts or data into visual media, and then this process of how we bridge the gap between those two things. Every one of you have complex data intermixed in some way, shape, or form, or you're communicating something out in terms of storytelling about the experience of this data. So I'm curious about how you all see yourselves as bridging that gap. Anyone can start, and not everybody has to answer.
I don't think of myself as a translator.
Mm.
I'm uh, I'm doing something that's not a literal translation. I'm taking what I'm learning from the people who are the experts, and seeing what kinds of directions it takes me in. I don't, I think the scientists do better at describing their, their work and their results and their processes. But I can reach a different audience. And I have found in my collaborations with scientists that they're very happy to have another way to talk to people.
That really resonates with my experience as well, Suze. I feel like so often, especially, it's always interesting to work with like scientists who never work with an artist and those who have worked with an artist. Because like usually those who have worked with an artist before, they have this like way more open, just like here's this bit, like I trust your vision. Here's kind of maybe a story, like tell me what you want to do. Then others can be like, here's a graph and all this stuff. And it's interesting to have to kind of say sometimes like, hey, actually, a graph maybe isn't the most effective thing here. Like I often tell my students that, we're making up a new language for how to sketch something, how to draw something, how to paint something. So I feel like it's like Sue said, not a translation. It's almost like an invention of an entire new way of seeing what they're so embedded in through data and their day-to-day operations in the field or wherever they are doing their research. So I feel like it's like my job to kind of say, hey, like let's look at this from a different perspective where you don't see it every day.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would love to echo what you guys are saying about like I really don't see myself as like a translator or really like a science communicator. I think that like one of those things that you learn when you're like learning how to write, like one of the first things you learn is they tell you to think about who your audience is and to change the way you're writing based on your audience. And I found that once I threw that in the garbage can and I got rid of that and started just writing for myself, like I wrote that I write for the things that I want to read and with the contexts of what I would think of as common sense or like my vocabulary. And paradoxically, once I started writing for myself and not for an audience, is when all of a sudden it felt like lots of people were connecting with my art and telling me that it really spoke to them. And so like I don't really know what that means or how it works, but I think there's something there about like the beauty of art not necessarily trying to use it as like a tool for communication, but how it ends up being that way anyway.
Right. Yeah, I think whether or not you're recognizing that or not, you're communicating something out to the world, which is perfect lens to my next question of each of you in your own way are communicating the science out. And so my curiosity for each of you, if you think about this, is what is one thing that you hope people will walk away with when they encounter your work?
I realized, especially with that chorus project, uh, that if I made someone scratch their head and think, now, why did the artist do that? I'm ahead. That's what I want. I want to provoke people to think and feel and be curious.
Continue or go ahead, Maddie, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that the best, like the responses I've loved like the most when people like walk away is when they engage with my art and then we then have a conversation that it's like some sort of like doorway into being like, oh hey, like I also am like a trail worker and like let's talk about all these like funny stories that I've had like of being on the trail, or like, oh, I've also done wildland fire, and like then we start talking about like working in that field where it so I guess like I want it to just sort of like be this way of connecting me to people, and then we can just have these interesting conversations and ask these fun questions together.
Yeah, to echo on what was said, I think it's my perspective of how the impact of my work and like what I hope it does, I think radically shifted when I started teaching. Because prior to that, I think it was like I wanted people to like have a foot in the door and like have, be curious or inspired or love a place, etc. And I think I realized once I started teaching was that, I am building a container for someone to enter into this landscape and this experience with me in potentially, in whatever way that is for them. For some people, literally, they turn me on like YouTube to put them to sleep. They pay me $30 a month for that. And I'm like, I'm so glad. You're like, if that's how I can be, what I can be for them, right? Like, that's awesome. And then I also have students who, like, one of them, she's terminally ill. She turns my videos on for her, and that was how she was regaining some of her neurological function, and she's now passing on her account to her daughter. And it's just like I feel like I get like teared up talking about it because it's just like I think things like that is like the impact that I didn't know that teaching and art could. I mean, I think you always hope it can have that, right? And it was just so eye-opening to have these conversations and these connections with people to realize like, yeah, like a creative practice and welcoming people into that has so much power, and everybody will make that into what they need at the time, whether that's to put them to sleep or a safe, peaceful, creative space amidst all the other turmoil that's happening in our world, where they can have a safe spot to reflect or deal with grief or just make something pretty or make a beautiful, big experimental mess if that's what they want to do too. Because many of us, that's what we do too.
Absolutely. So it's sort of the door opener to conversation and curiosity, as really the heart of what you all are doing, and whether that's building greater curiosity about the scientific research that you are taking a look at and putting into your work, or you're essentially encouraging people to want to know more in some way, shape, or form. I really love that. So we do have one question from the audience, and I'd like to ask you all that one. I think it's a fabulous one. It says, "What makes for an ideal scientist in a art science collaboration?" His name is Bill. No.
I actually think that question is what makes the ideal artist. Um, my piece of advice in the talk on collaborating with scientists that I gave not too long ago was basically these are really busy people. You know, many times they're trying to teach, they're trying to do research, they're trying to write, they've got, graduate students. Um, they're really terribly busy. And so I always feel like it's my job to do my homework, to do my best to understand what they're doing and what what the meaning of it is, and to have some good questions, to have not waste their time. So I think it's more on the onus is a little more on the artist to be a good collaborator than to be on than the scientist. I've worked with quite a variety, and like I say, I feel like my doing my homework is the best thing I can do.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience to Sue, because I feel like usually by the time I'm connected with a scientist, they already know that they want to be using like our creative skill set. So I think like in some ways I feel like the scientists sometimes in some ways self-select that like they, maybe found us or found their work and want these creative avenues to communicate things. So what I've found is that, like Sue said, making sure that I can make the most of my limited time with the scientist. And I think also just like what's been really cool in my experience was that when scientists came in with a very like for me personally like a pretty blank slate of what they were expecting or looking for, because I felt like that was when we had the most avenue for like amazing potential collaboration where and I've done some where they come in like I want an infographic and this is what needs to be in it, and that's amazing. But other times it's like I want an infographic and I have no idea what the elements should be. Let's have a half an hour conversation and see what happens from there. So I think like the word and the question that Marjorie used was, collaboration is really at the heart of that. And just both people adapting their practices and expectations really, really realistically to like what's attainable, whether the artists, are they volunteering their time? Do they have budget to support them? Whatever that is, like that is an important part of that conversation, I think, too, for both sides. And it's not something that's often talked about in like the science communication space, but I think really should be a bigger part of that. Now, given where our political climate is right now, like I'm going to keep volunteering if I need to.
I think what you said, Claire, earlier about working with scientists who have worked with artists before versus scientists that have not worked with scientists before, there is a very big difference. And I think that's something that I've noticed is scientists, this is a very big generalization, but some of them are really scared of art. And they tell me over and over again that they've never worked with an artist before. They don't know anything about art, and there's all this like I don't know, which is fine. It's not, if that's not like your area of expertise, I don't expect you to have any knowledge of it. But I find that it's very interesting for these very smart people to sort of have these mental blocks about how they think that they will not be able to understand art. Um, and which is, I have seen also with artists who think that they will not be able to understand science. And I have gone into art scientist collaborations where, artists are asking lots of questions and they're super interested and the scientists are super engaging and, answer lots of things. And then we turn around and go, okay, and now do the scientists have any questions for the artists? And it's always silence. And I think that while I have worked with many great scientists, I think that what has made the best collaborators are the ones that, also want to ask me questions and really like engage with me and don't necessarily see it as like, I'm here, I have the science, I give the science to the artist, and then the artist makes something, but sees it more as like this opportunity to really get to learn from each other, I think makes it this like super meaningful experience.
And Maddie inspired me to think of something, which is that in the conversations with scientists and projects that have meant the most to me, and I think been the most successful, was when the scientist was really willing to look at their own personal experience of their data and their data collection, and they were able to take off that objective hat and put on their like, I'm a human being, this is terribly sad, or like that day really sucked and it was hot and I got bitten by a hornet, like all this different stuff, because those stories are the ones that like I find most interesting, and I know a big layperson audience will also likely find more interesting. Yes, I think just like as a scientist being able to say, okay, like I'm going to be asked to be put into like the more subjective data side of what I do and think of it as data because your personal experience is a form of data alongside your scientific data. So how can we like, I feel like my job as an artist is to like pull that story out a little bit and be like, it's okay to feel things because that's my job is to convey that feeling. Like, we're now out of your objective science data, validation space, and we're in the personal story space, and that's how people will connect with you.
Helping people make that emotional connection. There's that lovely bridge between art and science where it does create that emotional inspiration for you when you look at the work or you connect with them on a different level. So thank you to all three of you for sharing your stories and sharing your artwork and creating such beautiful, inspirational work as well. I'm going to hand things over to Hazel so that she can close out the day.